This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence, and in this series, we are exploring coaching outdoors and how being outdoors is good, if not vital, for our well-being. I'm talking to thought leaders and individuals who share their passion for coaching as they share their philosophy, research and practices with you. Our aim is to inspire you to unlock the potential of coaching when combined with being in nature and outdoors. Hello and welcome to this episode in our series on coaching outdoors. Today I have with me a very special guest, Ellie Lloyd-Jones. Ellie is the founder of Elevate Netwalking, where she combines her coaching with nature-based walks. As somebody who is passionate about mental health and physical well-being, in today's episode we're going to talk about the impact of nature on mental health, as well as exploring the themes of neurodiversity and imposter syndrome. We're also going to look at how mindfulness and self-care show up in the coaching outdoors space. And we're going to talk a little bit about how Ellie structures her outdoor netwalking events. So, Ellie, very warm welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on the show and on the series. We're talking about coaching outdoors, and I can't wait to learn more about you as an outdoor coach. I've known you for quite some time through the Better, Bolder, Braver community with Francis and Simon, and I'm well aware that you are a coach that embraces the outdoors, and you immediately sprung to mind when the AC decided upon doing a series about this. So I'm eager today to tap into some of your experience. So perhaps we'll start here. Tell me about your relationship to coaching outdoors and how that's all come about in your life and what it's like for you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I feel like a bit of an imposter when it comes to outdoor coaching. I've done some amazing courses with the likes of Anna-Marie Watson and Leslie Roberts, who are fantastic, inspiring and really big thought leaders in this space. And a lot of their questions that they start with talk about your relationship with nature and the outdoors. And people talk about how as a baby, they were always outdoors. And as a child, they have these really fond memories. And that's not the case for me. There's nothing traumatic that's happened. It just wasn't something I particularly valued. I just took it very much for granted to be outside. But I wasn't really drawn to it until maybe 8 years ago, particularly since I've got 3 children, and one of them in particular, I see the difference in him when he's outdoors, massively. And like a lot of parents, when you start to see things in your children, you start to reflect on maybe where that need has come from. And I started to unpick, actually, I feel better outdoors, but I hadn't been conscious of it. And the whole moving my body outdoors as well really helps me from a mental health point of view. And so from about 8 years ago, we started camping with the kids. And I saw a massive difference in them. And as I say, I felt a difference in me. So I started walking more and getting outdoors. And 3 years ago, we moved from the suburbs in South Manchester to the countryside just outside Chester. And countryside is all around us now. We have cows and sheep as neighbours. It's wonderful. And the difference, particularly being a coach as well, of noticing the difference in myself when I have the spaciousness outdoors, when I have the autonomy to just walk and I don't feel confined in 4 walls, is huge. And it was a couple of years ago when I was talking to a coaching friend of mine, and I was talking about how I can fit everything in, because it's really important to me to be out in the outdoor space. But then I'm doing my coaching business and I'm a parent and I've got other things going on. And he said, well, why don't you combine the two? Why don't you coach people outdoors? And I was like, what an incredibly simple idea. And why did I not think of that? But then the imposter in me came in and said, who would want to go for a walk with me when they could go for a walk with other people? Why would they choose to do that? So that's sort of where it all came from. That was about 18 months ago, and that I started to move into the nature element because, I'm at my best outdoors. So it makes sense to work with people in that space.
Yeah, that's great. I'm keen to learn a little bit about this format that you follow in terms of how you do that with others. But before we go there, I'm curious, you mentioned your kids there, and I can relate with this completely. Our kids are quite different people when they're given a field to play in as to when they're in the house. And I'm curious about your experience, both for you with your kids and also with those that you work with in terms of coaching outdoors. What is it you think that changes or is different, or what happens where you see that shift?
Well, I'll speak from 2 angles. The one child in particular that I notice a big difference when he's outdoors. I always say that we could have done with moving somewhere with a paddock so that he could just run and have this freedom. That saying of climbing the walls, he climbs the walls if he's in the house for too long, or mentally climbs the walls. He's quite difficult to have a conversation with if he hasn't been able to just kind of run and get some freedom, and he's almost like a caged animal. And I use the word claustrophobic. I can feel quite claustrophobic if I'm indoors, if I'm stuck in the same four walls, sitting down, being quite sedentary. So actually getting outdoors, I can feel my chest starts to expand, and I don't realise that I'm maybe breathing much shallower. I have this heaviness in my chest until I get outdoors and I walk, and there's something about that movement. There's something about unlocks something in my head when I'm a bit overwhelmed or feeling anxious or just really claustrophobic and trapped. Being outdoors just kind of settles all of that for me, and I come back feeling like I can tackle my challenges and the day. And I see that in my son. Obviously, as his mother, I don't know anything. So when I tell him that this is a good thing to do, he has no interest in taking any notice. He'll actively do the opposite. But I have hope that one day the penny might drop.
Yeah. I love that. What I'm hearing in there is a sense of expansion and the power that being outdoors, the way it can uplift us and give us that capacity. Is that the sort of thing that you experience with those that you work with outdoors as well? Do you see that?
Yeah, I use metaphor quite a lot outdoors with people. I coach people on a one-to-one basis, and I do group coaching in a networking environment. So in both of those settings, I'll invite people to just look to nature to see what is it maybe mirroring back about your inner world. I spoke to someone on a recent one-to-one coaching conversation, and she just stopped and looked at this big pile of brambles and said, that's what my head feels like. There's just all these brambles all messed up and I don't know how to start to untangle them. And so that's something that wouldn't necessarily have come out. She wouldn't necessarily have had the language to talk about how things were feeling in her head had we not been in nature. Seeing that and having it mirroring back. And there's the thing that everybody talks about when it comes to coaching outdoors is actually when you're walking side by side, you don't have the eye contact. So it gives you a sense of freedom and allows you to open up in ways that you possibly wouldn't do if you're sitting with the intensity of eye contact face to face in a small room potentially.
That's definitely a theme that's been evolving through this series already so far, is that walking side by side versus just being sat across a table or sat opposite even. Yeah, I've got this image in my mind of people looking out to the horizon, thinking more expansively, thinking longer term, perhaps bigger picture type stuff. And from my own experience, I know just being near the ocean or in a forest with big trees, there's a sense of awe, but also this sense of something bigger than yourself. And I think it does inspire you to just get out of this contracted small world that we sometimes put ourselves in, indoors particularly, and more so these days, I would say, since the pandemic. So I'm curious about how your journey has evolved in that time, perhaps in the last 4 years since then, where we experienced lockdown. And I think I sense a deeper craving to get outdoors more so these days and actually be with people too. That seems to be a strong theme. So thinking about your networking here, one of the unique things about you, Ellie, I mean, it's evident from your website, you love the outdoors. I mean, that's the first impression I got from your website when I saw it. And then there's this really inspiring aspect that you do this with groups of people. So I'm curious as to how that's experienced and what shows up there for you, Ellie.
I'll talk about my motivation behind it, if that's okay.
Yeah, brilliant. Great place to start.
So when I moved to the countryside, I didn't know many people in the area, and I've been juggling doing my coaching role with a part-time job as well, a part-time employed role. And trying to meet people I found really difficult to try and build my network locally. And I go to networking events and they're great for what they do, but I feel quite drained at the end of a networking event, really quite struggle afterwards, being in a room with so many people, so much sensory sort of stimulation. And so I went to another networking event and found people there who I really clicked with and really connected with, and we had shared values. And I thought, these are my people. This is what I would love to do more of. This is my idea of networking. But with me juggling, I couldn't go to these events regularly. So I spoke to them about it and they were like, well, set up your own, just to do your own thing if you can't come to ours. So that's what I did initially. That's where it started. And then I started to bring my coaching into it as well, because I think there's something really powerful about getting people away from the screens and the four walls. And I noticed as well that all of these networking events, you are sedentary. You are in the four walls. You're not getting fresh air. This anxiety around the elevator pitch. All of these things don't make for a great platform to promote yourself in your business. And you kind of coming away, and what are you getting from it? What are you leaving that event with if you haven't got your contacts or connections? So I set up my networking events to bring people together, to get away from technology. Again, a lot of these networking events are sedentary. You're not moving anywhere. And actually to try and fit in daily movement and time away from your screen. And it's precious time when you're running your own business as well, to be away from the actual doing of the role. So I was trying to think of ways that I could bring it all together that work for me. And I thought, well, if I build it, other people might come. So actually my networking events are centered around common challenges that people are facing at the minute. And I create like some coaching cards specific for that event. I frame the day, or frame the event, and get people to pair up. And every 20 minutes or so, we'll swap pairs and we'll do some reflections. And in that time, the locations that I choose, one of them is Bickerton Hill in Cheshire. And that, as you were talking about, looking at the horizon, they've got some beautiful vantage points across the Cheshire Plain. And so I pick that location particularly so that people can escape the four walls and lift their gaze. We tend to be looking at short distances at the laptop, at our phone. It's not very often that we lift our gaze up to look at that horizon. It has such amazing properties to do that. It's amazing for our brains to actually have a soft gaze on the horizon. So I pick that event, that location for that reason. And I explain and invite nature in. And I have events in Delamere Forest. As you mentioned before, the forest, there's something about the sensory element, the smells in the forest and the sounds as you're crunching through the leaves. And all of that adds to the experience. We don't often get many experiences. A lot of them are things and tasks and things we need to do. But I've created these events to be an experience. And the whole premise of them, from my point of view, is that people don't have to worry about anything. I've set the venue, or set the location, I've set the routes, I've made sure that it's safe. I invite people along, I give them the what 3 words location, because in a rural location it can be really difficult to find with a postcode. I tell people what to expect. I tell them what the topic is going to be, how many people are going to be there. I manage the expectations for what the walk is going to be, and I contain it. So the idea is that it's really easy for people to just come along. They just have to rock up on the day once they've got their ticket, and I facilitate the rest. They just have to come along and enjoy it. And at the end of it, they've learned something new. They've moved their body. They've had a full sensory experience and connected with like-minded business owners, so they don't feel as isolated and lonely, and have actually met people face to face in person. Something that you can actually like reach out and touch the arm of that you can't do in the virtual space. Which brings me back to your question about COVID and how it's evolved. I think people massively missed that when we were in the virtual world and weren't allowed within a certain amount of space of somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in that we could get into. I'm just curious, sort of practically, how many people are you talking about in these networking events? How many do you typically have?
I'm trying to cap it at 10 at the moment, so that it's not a massive group of people, because it can be quite intimidating. And the people that come along to my events are the people who tend to come to it for the same reasons that I set it up, because it's a more relaxed way. It can be quite intimidating to have 20 people. And from my point of view, there's only me, so I can't be at the front and the back of the group. So actually to try and herd 20 people who've maybe wandered off is not that practical. But it's a nice intimate number to have 10, so you get a chance to speak to everybody.
That's a great number. I really like the structure that you offer there, to have that framework that gives people a sort of, not just a sense of safety, but a sense of purpose in terms of the actual doing something together, as well as the softer side of actually being with people, being outside in nature. I'm curious as to what sort of feedback you get, or what sort of transformation you witness in having these experiences.
I think a lot of people tend to say, oh, I woke up this morning and I was like, oh, I need to go for a walk. I've booked on to come to this walk. And they always leave smiling, like lighter. You can see the lightness. I love to see when I do the check-in at the start. I kind of watch for body language and things. And there's nearly always like laughter at the end, just a lightness, a playfulness from people. And everybody says that they're just so glad that they came along. A couple of months ago, there was someone who came along who I've known for a while, but she'd been struggling to get out. She'd had a family bereavement, and she'd been stuck in the house since, and she'd found it difficult to get out. And so actually the idea of having somebody who's already organised the sort of walk and an excuse to get out of the house to move. And since then, she'd upped her sort of step count every day. And that was the catalyst for her to get out and get moving. And that's amazing. I love that. My whole thing is if I can change one person's sort of outlook or one person's day, then my job is done. So I love that by me just putting on these walks, it does have a big impact on people's days, lives.
Yeah, some of it's tangible. I guess some of it's intangible in some respects. It's a very sort of deeply personal and subjective thing. And again, coming back to the structure side of things, I'm kind of curious to get into a little bit more of the detail on that. But typically, how long are you outdoors for together?
I schedule about 2 hours for us to be out. It's a 5-kilometre circular walk. We're just kind of making progress as we go along. We'll have 3 pause points roughly after every 20 minutes. The 2 hours allows for the pause points that are about 10 minutes each, and just a few sort of people who are a bit stragglers or maybe not arrived on time, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's I tend to get questions like, I'm not very fit, I don't want to hold the group back. But it's not a race. It's the whole point is it's a companionable walk, and we all walk to the pace that's comfortable for everybody. So it's not a fitness experience. It's just a way to get people moving.
So you were saying that you pair people up. What sort of structure you give them in terms of working together, if any? What sort of exercises or ideas do you offer people for that experience?
So I'll give the last one I did as an example. So we set off, and because people are keen to talk to each other, because it is a networking event as well as the group coaching, I think the networking element is a byproduct of the work that we do on these walks. So I'll invite people to just pair up with somebody for the first 20 minutes, and we'll just have a natural conversation, whatever comes up for you, to the first pause point. Then I will introduce what the topic is, and that's based on the survey that I'll send out to everybody who's booked onto the events beforehand to ask what their challenges are. And then I will create the topic based on the need of the group. And I'll introduce that need, ask people to swap pairs, to pair up with someone they haven't spoken to yet. And I'll give them a prompt card with questions on about the topic. So the latest one that we did a couple of weeks ago was on organisation and time management. So there were lots of questions on there to kind of ask each other and to just reflect on around how do you currently manage your time? How much time do you take for breaks? How important is it? How do you feel when you've had a break versus when you've not had a break? What do you notice the difference of? So we'll chat about that for about 20 minutes until we come to the next pause point. And the pause points are at specific points that I've put out because, particularly this one was at Bickerton, because of the vantage point. So it gives people time to just be. We'll reflect and share reflections if we feel comfortable too. And then the next set of cards I gave people were task management frameworks. So things like the Eisenhower matrix and Pomodoro technique, things like that. So there were a few on there for people to mull over and just to think about whether they've come across them before, whether they've used them and forgotten about them, think of different ways that they could be used. We'll walk for another 20 minutes, another pause point as we reflect, and then another card with just reflection questions on that we'll reflect till we get to the end of the event. And then we'll come together, talk about what taking away, what's different, what's changed for us on the walk, how we're feeling, exchange business cards, and that's it. And then I'll send a follow-up sort of survey afterwards to just capture feedback. I forgot to mention before the event as well, they get the survey to complete, but there's also all of the instructions as to what to expect, my contact number in case they get lost, any eventuality, a link to the FAQs, any questions people might have. So the whole thing, it does start before the event takes place. From my mind, it starts from the moment someone books on.
Yeah, there's so much about that, which I think is really inspiring. And I can imagine coaches listening to this being inspired by the structure that you're offering there and the possibilities and the opportunities that come with that. And what I love about that from my own point of view, listening to you describe it there as I imagine it, is there's enough structure there in order to make it a rich experience for somebody. But you never know what's going to come up, and you don't know what kind of weather you're going to have, what kind of walk you're going to have collectively and individually. And then, I can imagine that on occasions, if not frequently, people are going to have breakthroughs, large and small, just because they've been with that person or been in that environment. And I imagine that is a very common theme for you running these. So that must be, to use one of your words, quite uplifting in terms of your motivation to keep doing this and expand this going forward. I'm curious now to learn a little bit more about Ellie. And you mentioned earlier about imposter syndrome, and you must have been through sort of various stages and challenges coming up with the concept here. I'm sure it's evolved. So I'm kind of curious as to your experience of the evolution of what it is that you run today. And I'm also curious as to perhaps some of the challenges, maybe more the internal challenges as well as the more practical challenges that you've had to face to be able to get to this stage. So take us on that journey a little bit, Ellie. And I'm imagining, like with any new creation, there's always that point at the beginning, I think, where it really starts to happen. So I'm kind of curious if you could take us back to then, when this invisible idea became a visible thing, and perhaps some of the challenges that you faced developing your own method of taking people outdoors.
Yeah, they're daily, the challenges, Rob. Still challenging. So my first challenge was the first few months I used to offer these events for free, because I thought, well, I'm just inviting people to come for a walk. And maybe there was an imposter syndrome element in me that was like, who would want to pay to come on a walk with me? Just do it for free. And I got interest, but people would pull out on the day. And as I said before, I juggled working part-time and doing this. So I'd have to arrange my days off from my employed position to run these events. And then people just wouldn't be turning up, or I'd message them and they say, oh no, I've got an appointment, I can't come. So that was the first challenge. So I started to charge for them, which that was a difficult thing. Oh goodness, trying to get people to pay. But coaching for good is quite a big driver for me. So a percentage of the money that I take goes to ecology. So to help fight climate change. So there's very much a coaching for good element in the payments side of things. And then the constant challenge that I have is getting people to come along consistently, or a consistent number of people. So I'll have some months where, I'll have 10 people coming along, and then others when there won't be anybody. Or I'll get one person booking on and I'll have to contact them and say, look, I still go whether people book on or not. So you're welcome to come with me, and you're essentially getting a one-to-one with me if you want to, or you can rebook for another date when we've got people booked on. Most of the time people choose to book on a different dates when they're going to meet other people, but that's not always the case. Some people do come along when it's just the two of us, which gives a nice rich experience. Yeah, I think the challenge is sometimes the last event that I didn't feel very well. I was coming down with like this flu and I felt dreadful, but people are relying on me. When all I want to do is lie in bed with some Lemsip, I need to get up and walk and lead people and make sure everyone's safe and facilitate these sessions, which, I always feel great when I'm doing it because it's something that I love. So it doesn't feel like a hardship. It's just afterwards I feel quite tired. So the evolving part of the payment side of things, my challenge at the minute, I've actually got somebody on board who's an ambassador for me, who runs my events for me in Cambridge, which is amazing. So my challenge is to bring on more coaches to do that, because I get lots of people on social media contacting me saying, I'd love to come to one of your events, but Cheshire's a bit far for me. Do you do any near me? So my dream is to make these events accessible across the country. And also my background is in leadership. So I've always worked in a leadership position in the corporate world for 20 years. So I actually love that element of working with other people as well. There's something great when you're in it with somebody else rather than having to do it yourself, because that in itself is a challenge, trying to keep going when it's all on you. Everything falls on your shoulders, all of the risk assessment, the insurance, just the process of how structure of the events, the promotion, the marketing, the connections, and all of that, the follow-up. That can be really hard. So actually doing that with other people, since Mike came on and started running events in Cambridge, it just makes it even more enjoyable to share the journey and share the successes. I love it when he has a great event and I see the feedback that he gets from running the events, more so than when I get feedback about my own. I love that element of it. So that's my current challenge.
Wow. Yeah. And further inspiring the idea that you're taking this concept and potentially expanding it regionally, and the idea that there are other coaches out there, some who may be listening to this podcast and may be interested. So we'll definitely share your contact details before the end, Ellie.
Thank you.
I'm further inspired by your vision with all of this, and the fact that actually giving back to the environment as well through this process. I think that's a lovely idea. And I think there's so many benefits in terms of people actually experiencing coaching, but also experiencing nature. And also through that process, it's almost reciprocal in the sense that it's in some shape or form, hopefully giving back to the environment to sustain the cycle of it all, I suppose. I'm curious, Ellie, I know this is something that you and I occasionally cross paths on in the various communities that you and I belong to. You mentioned there a little bit of illness and still having to show up and deliver on the session. I'm curious about your own well-being and self-care here. This is perhaps something we haven't touched upon much in this particular series, but it's absolutely a really fundamental aspect, in my opinion, of it's all well and good taking people outdoors and on these experiences, but we've got to be looking after ourselves as well. So I'm curious as to getting a little peek inside to Ellie's rituals and what you do, which may or may not be outdoors. I appreciate that, but this is what's behind, or what somebody who does coaching outdoors does to support themselves. Because I know you're quite mindful of self-care and our own well-being, and it's something that I think you role model to other coaches. That's what I see. So from that point of view, how has that changed over the years? And perhaps maybe tying this into the conversation that we're having today, how has putting these events together informed or evolved that process for you from a point of self-care?
That's a really good question. Yeah, self-care is incredibly important to me. It always has been on one level, particularly since I had children and realised there was no time for self-care. But about 4 years ago, when I left the corporate world, it was because I had a really big episode of burnout and got quite poorly with it. And like most people, because we're human, I had to learn the hard way that we can't continue to just keep on that treadmill and keep going and going and going and expect our bodies to just keep up with us. And so it took me learning the really hard way and I was off sick for about 5 months from work, which happened the month before COVID hit. I properly burnt out, and then a month later COVID hit and my children were at home with me full time, and I was trying to homeschool them while trying to cope with physical effects of burnout, which was not fun at all. So I never want to go back to that point. So it's incredibly important to me that I put my well-being and self-care first. And I think that comes through a lot of my coaching as well. I have quite a holistic approach that actually, if you're not getting enough sleep, if you're not feeding yourself with the right nutrients, if you're not doing things that feed your soul and bring you joy and moving your body, it can be really hard to show up for yourself, never mind other people. So again, moving to the countryside was a big part of my recovery from being burnt out. So having access to the countryside and being able to walk outdoors just from my back garden is massive for me. It not being contained by the concrete jungle, as I'll call it, just seeing trees and the canal and all of the animals. That is as important to me as breathing it, because I've learned what it's like to ignore that. And yeah, and I think when you mentioned role modelling it, I think integrity is a massive part of my value structure. And I can't do the work that I do if I don't feel it. If I was to just sit inside in my jogging bottoms, smoking a cigarette and watching reruns of, I don't know, Only Fools and Horses all day, eating a Rustler's burger, well, that wouldn't be me if I'm then taking people on outdoors. So it's actually easier for me to run my business knowing that it's actually an extension of me, because I don't have to think or I don't have to try. I'm just me inviting people to be part of my sort of journey, part of my world. So that kind of, it's just really natural. I have to be on my own for quite a period of time to be able to function properly. So going outdoors on my own is really important. And I'll get up in the morning and I'll do yoga and I'll do meditation. Most mornings, not every morning, because, you know, life happens. But all of that really helps with my self-care. If I don't do all of that, I can't show up. And like I say, I've learned the hard way.
Yeah. You've reminded me of something when I think one of the first times I met you, when I heard about you, you were talking about the experience of being an introvert. And I realised that we haven't touched upon that today. And I'm kind of curious to tap into that. Hopefully I feel confident enough to be able to do this with your permission and sort of get into that a little bit, because I think there's a really interesting aspect here that you just touched upon there in your response, perhaps to an outsider, maybe not. I don't know. I'm sort of second guessing a little bit here, but actually somebody who would perhaps see themselves as an introvert to be then taking groups of people outdoors is almost a bit counterintuitive, really. So, because I've never asked this question to you before, Ellie, as to what's going on there for you in terms of that part of the sort of experience as both a coach and for you personally.
That's so interesting, because I see that as the perfect way to be an introvert, because it takes the focus off me if there's a group of people. That's my experience of it. And as an introvert, I have to manage my energy. really closely. And so for me, inviting people along, asking them what their challenges are, I can prepare for all of that behind the scenes. I create the bespoke coaching cards. I set the expectations at the start. So that's why I make everything as easy for other people as possible, because I can do all of the heavy lifting beforehand. So on the day, I'm just realizing this as I'm talking about it. I'm making it easy for everybody else, but I'm making it easy for myself as well. And so getting people to pair up, I'm not standing in front of everybody all of the time. I'm just facilitating the event, asking people what their thoughts are, what their reflections are, getting people to pair up. All of the questions and the resources are already on the paper for them to look at on the event itself. And yeah, that's how I manage it. I had to put my game face on the other week when I didn't feel very well. But because I know that because that enriches me and feeds my soul, that sort of environment. From my point of view, it almost takes the pressure off because it's outdoors. If I was doing that event online or standing up in front of people to do a group tutorial or group coaching event, incredibly different. But actually nature is the co-facilitator here. Nature does a lot of the work for me. Some might call it lazy, I don't know. But I can rely on nature to help me in that space. If there are silences, if there are things that maybe aren't going the way that I planned, nature holds that for me. So I don't feel like I'm doing it fully on my own.
Wow, that's such an insight. That's really fascinating to me as I'm imagining that. And I couldn't agree more with you in terms of the experiences I imagine it, and have had this experience that a silence, a pause on Zoom, for example, in a conversation is quite different to a pause when you're with somebody outdoors, because there's so much around you that kind of fills it. And I think we're in this sort of state of wonder, which I'm not sure we all experience when we're sat on Zoom. So yeah, I'm beginning to get a sense of what you're talking about there in terms of the experiential point of view, not just for others, but for yourself as well. And I love this idea of sort of ease and flow that it sounds to me like you're describing there. It's almost the path of least resistance in many respects, playing to your own strengths, but also playing to the strengths of nature as well. Let's take people out into that environment and have faith in that environment, bringing the insights, the answers, the courage, the strength that we perhaps need when we're not feeling it before we actually put our shoes on.
Yeah. And it's reminded me actually what I used to do with my youngest. We go camping as a family. And when my youngest, he's like 8 now, but when he was maybe 2 or 3, and he'd wake up really early. And so that he didn't wake the rest of the tent up or the rest of the campsite up, I would say to him, let's go on a little mindfulness walk, because he wouldn't stop talking. And I needed a little bit of headspace the first thing in the morning. So I go, let's do a mindfulness walk. Let's spend 3 minutes, not talk. We don't talk, but we listen. What can we hear? What can we see? What can we smell? What can we touch? What can we taste? And he took it really seriously, and he would be quiet for 3 minutes. And I'd just be going, oh, thank goodness, just give me a few minutes. But then he'd come back with all these amazing things. He was really taking it seriously. And that was like a lesson for me as well. That was before I started doing it. It was probably around the same sort of time that I started thinking about how important nature was for me, because I saw how great it was for him, and as a byproduct me, because it gave me 3 minutes of peace and quiet. So I was like, great, let's do it again. Let's keep doing it. Let's have a little bit of quiet in the morning. But it then brought me back being mindful to the tent and to the family afterwards, and we'd spent a little bit of time together. So it's really powerful, that silence.
Yeah. Is that something you encourage on your networks when you're out there? Do you purposefully have a mindfulness aspect to it or a silence aspect to it?
I don't. I invite it with the setting the expectations that we're in nature. We're going to use nature as we can. And I talk about the reason that I've chosen that location, and to welcome nature into the conversations if there's anything that they feel particularly drawn to. And there are times people will walk and stop and go, oh, there's a bee on the floor there, keep an eye, because they've noticed, and you wouldn't necessarily see that, or point out a caterpillar, or listen to the bird, that Merlin app where you can listen to the birds, the different bird sounds. And at Bickerton there's a cuckoo, so you can hear the cuckoo going. So we'll invite it there, and it just adds a richness to the event, which again, it turns it into an experience rather than it just being ticking off. Been to a networking event this morning.
That's fascinating. With that in mind, obviously client confidentiality, but have you had any or have you witnessed any profound experiences with those that you've been on one of these walks with, like a major shift or insight or change in your experience so far?
Yeah, and one that's not necessarily nature-based, but I did a one-to-one outdoor coaching session with a client around Chester Walls. last month. So what's around the Roman walls. And she was talking about how she didn't feel very seen or visible in her business anymore. And her whole thing was about visibility. That's what she did. And I know that I was feeling a little bit, I was thinking, I don't know where this is going because I'm not getting any breakthroughs here. The classic thing that you shouldn't do as a coach is not about you, but you get stuck in your own head.
Yeah.
It's not about me, it's about the client. But I was like, I don't know where to go now because I don't know. I've kind of used all of my resources and we're not getting anywhere from my mind. And then we came to, so I don't know how familiar you or the listeners are with Chester, but Chester's got the cathedral, it's got the Roman walls, it's got like the amphitheatre. And there's actually a castle near Rudy car park around the back near the racecourse. It's more of a castle ruins. And as we were walking past, she stopped at the castle and looked at it and mentioned, actually, we don't see the castle much. I bet it was a real draw at some point before it went into the ruins. And I feel sorry for the castle. It's like a big thing and we don't see it much anymore. And I invited her to, so thinking about the conversation we've just had about you and how you're feeling that you're not very visible, and what reflections can you take from that based on like the surroundings that we have? And she suddenly went, I'm the castle. And she was suddenly able to parallel and use a bit of a metaphor around how the castle was and how she was feeling. And it was just this huge weight had lifted off her shoulders. And I had to have a word with myself and say, look, this is why nature, and I know that the castle's not nature, but it's the surroundings, it's the getting outdoors, that to just have faith in the surroundings, that helps. It helps with the coaching process. And that was a huge shift for her. And the whole nature of the conversation changed after that. There was a lightness, there was less intensity to it. There was like almost this need before this sort of urgency. And it just dissipated all of that. So that was an amazing transformation.
That's brilliant. That's such a great example. On the theme of inspiration, you mentioned Anna Marie and also Leslie, who I'm very proud to say are part of this same series. So it's great hearing from them too. In terms of your own inspiration, and by no means limit yourself to the world of coaching outdoors, as growing as that is, I'm curious as to where you get your inspiration from. Outdoors, obviously, but in terms of books, podcasts, people, approaches maybe, that you feel perhaps inspire and or support you in terms of the work that you do today?
Oh, gosh, there's loads. And I'll probably think of loads after this.
Sure.
This conversation. I love listening to Dr. Chatterjee's Feel Better, Live More, which is a huge podcast, but I love his approach, and his ethos is very similar to mine around actually getting back to basics. I do love listening to Anna Marie's podcast as well, actually.
Yes, good show.
It is. I tend to just Google a lot of things as well. I'll notice, so we don't have a dog, but we kind of dog sit. We sort of share dog ownership 3 days a week. And whenever I have him, he brings me a lot of inspiration, actually, when I notice that how he reacts outdoors and is in his element. When he's indoors before he's gone for a walk, he's crazy and really quite difficult to be around because he'll like jump around and bark and be really activated. But when I bring him back from a walk where he's had the freedom off the lead, he's had movement, he's been sniffing around, so all of his senses are satiated. He's much calmer. And that in itself provides an inspiration for me to think, that's what humans need. That's what my children need. And that then will inspire me to start researching and Googling research. It's just been newspaper articles. I love to understand the facts. So I read something from one of the government surveys from like 10 years ago the other day to say that today we're 20% less active than we were in the 1960s. And this was from 10 years ago. And if we continue on the same trajectory, even out, we'll be 35% less active by the year 2030. And I'm like, that's crazy because our jobs are so much more sedentary. So those are the sort of things that inspire me. I'm just constantly looking and thirsty for facts and figures to sort of support my passion, just in case I come across anybody who doesn't believe me.
Yeah, that's great. There's so much in that. A couple of things that stood out for me there. The fact that it's, again, nature, like kids, pets, and that you draw so much inspiration from there. And I can completely relate to that. Actually, I get most of my inspiration from there. It's amazing what our own kids can teach us about coaching, to your earlier point, or what they can teach us about perhaps what good coaching could look like unknowingly. So I absolutely love that, Ellie. And I think it's also, my thoughts are sort of extending into the future now. And I'm thinking, well, hopefully there will be a turning point and maybe our work will become more active and more outdoors and involve more movement, and maybe the work that you're doing with bringing groups of people outdoors is part of that movement. I hope so, no pun intended. I appreciate the time's really flown today. Actually, just chatting with you, I feel like we've only skimmed the surface and I'm keeping an eye on the clock here. So I'm just going to begin to wrap up. But before I do, is there anything that you feel we perhaps haven't touched upon today that you feel would be of great benefit to the listener in the context of what we're talking about today?
There's something that I'm starting to kind of work towards, again, based on my own journey and that I see in my children, which would be a whole other podcast series, I'm sure, but just around the aspects of neurodiversity. And there's a lot of neurodiversity awareness happening now. And that's a journey that, as I say, I'm on with both myself and my children. And I do think that the work of outdoor coaching can play a really important role in that. Actually giving people the space and the freedom can really help people with a certain brain makeup to feel less, what's the word I'm thinking of? Maybe feel a little bit more accepted, or that their creativity is appreciated a bit more, or the way that they work is more acceptable. There's a growing pocket of people who are aware that sitting at a desk, forcing out being creative and productive isn't the way that works for them. And I feel that myself, which is where I'm starting to unpack actually, is that why I love to be outdoors so much? Because I'm much better in that space and I'm much more creative. I think we all are as humans, but I think there is a particular pocket of people who actually, when we celebrate the way that they think and the way that their brain operates, actually doing that outdoors, doing it with movement, doing it with nature, doing it with freedom, away from the constraints and constant demands of technology, which only overwhelm an already busy, overactive brain. I think there's a massive space for that with the outdoor coaching, and that's something I'm just starting to just get curious about. But as I say, that's a whole other podcast episode.
Yeah, it is. And just to give the AC a little shout out here, we've done a couple of series on diversity and inclusion, and it's fascinating to me how all of these different themes and topics are starting to overlap. We've done mental health and wellbeing earlier this year, and coaching for the climate crisis. George, who's a part of this series as a guest, hosted that series. And there's so much here that's starting to overlap. And I'm fascinated as to how all of these different themes are going to converge in the future. But I think that's such an important point you're making there, Ellie. I know with my own first-hand experience with a number of different kids, they're just completely different kids outdoors, and you think the confines of a classroom or being stuck in the home is just not the place for them, and what the opportunities and possibilities are for potentially our future leaders, really, in terms of nurturing them and creating an environment that plays to their strengths and needs is something well worthy of consideration. So you mentioned the podcast series Coaching Outdoors, Anne-Marie's podcast earlier,
yes.
And you've got your own podcast series, which I feel it deserves some attention as well, because that's related to our topic today. So could you tell our listener a little bit about that, Ellie?
Yes, so I co-host a podcast series called Force of Nature with Chris Kenworthy, who's another mutual friend of ours and a fellow coach that lives in Leeds. And so we just chat. It's unplanned. It's a geek out of a couple of coaches talking about what's coming up for us that any given week. But we're both people who feel this pull to be outdoors, that we feel like caged animals if we're not outside. So we'll sometimes do before and after sort of episodes of outdoor swimming. We've done an all-night gong meditation. We've done breathwork classes. So we'll record a little bit beforehand and then record afterwards. Yeah, and sometimes we'll just message each other that week, say, what's coming up for you? And I'd be like, I'm feeling really angry this week. We're like, right, let's just talk about it on the podcast. How do you feel that in your body? We're both quite somatic and very much adhere to the belief that we're not just brains. We are brain, heart, body. We're a full being. And that's what we talk about. How do we integrate all of that together? We just geek out, really.
Yeah, that's great. All of a sudden, I've got this image of our listener listening to your podcast, this podcast, and feeling the urge to go outdoors with it and go for a walk and listen to more of this inspirational material. And yeah, the journey leads from there, doesn't it? Like you said earlier, I think there's a sort of a ripple effect that goes on for each of us individually here as we follow our curiosity. Brilliant. So I imagine our listener will want to reach out to you, Ellie, if not to join you on a walk, maybe as somebody who's interested in supporting you somewhere around the UK in terms of making more of these types of walks happen. So where can our listener best find you and connect with you, Ellie?
So it's my website, elevatewithellie.co.uk, and I'm most prevalent on LinkedIn, Ellie Lloyd-Jones. They're the two best places that you can find me. I am on Instagram as well, at Elevate with Ellie. So those, if you can't find me in those three places, then I don't know where else you can get me. If you want to come along to one of my walks, I'm on Eventbrite as well.
That's fantastic. So thank you for sharing those details. My final question for today then, Ellie, what's inspired you in the last 7 days?
In the last 7 days, I've been camping over the last 7 days. And on Friday, I had such a wonderful walk along the beach. We were in Aberdaron in the Llyn Peninsula in Wales. A beautiful morning walk along the beach with my son, who I used to force to do mindfulness. And we were looking at pebbles and picking up pebbles and which ones feel different and which ones look different and which ones we're most drawn to. And that was really inspiring and just really calming. Came away feeling like I wish I lived closer to the sea.
Oh, I love that. How old's your son? Curious?
He's 8 now.
Wow, what an age to be doing that. That's lovely.
Oh yeah, he's not the one who I need to force outdoors. This one will just happily come with me.
Yeah, that's magic. Lovely. Well, Ellie, thank you so much for your time and spending time with me on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Rob. It's been really lovely.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, signature programs, member benefits, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop and increase your coaching expertise.